He cleans toilets for a living. My cousin laughed as I walked into the family reunion. Can't believe he even showed up. Then my cousin's fiancé shook my hand and froze. He stared at me, pulled out his phone, and whispered, "Wait, you're Dr. Noah?" The room went silent. I, 34M, stood in the doorway of the country club ballroom, watching my family mill around with champagne flutes and fake smiles. 5 years. It had been 5 years since I'd seen most of these people, and already I could feel the weight of their judgment settling on my shoulders like a familiar, suffocating blanket. My cousin spotted me first. She was holding court near the bar, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing wildly as she told some story to a cluster of relatives. When her eyes landed on me, her expression shifted from animated to something between pity and disgust. She leaned toward the woman next to her and whispered something, not even bothering to hide the smirk that followed. Then, loud enough for half the room to hear, she said it. "He cleans toilets for a living. Can't believe he even showed up." The laughter that followed wasn't quite as loud as her voice, but it was there. Scattered chuckles from people who'd known me since I was a kid, people who used to ruffle my hair and tell me I'd do great things someday. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept walking. I'd expected this. I'd prepared for this. What I hadn't prepared for was what happened next. My cousin's fiancé stepped forward to greet me. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of guy who probably played golf every weekend and had opinions about wine. He extended his hand with that practiced smile that rich people perfect early in life, and I shook it because I wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me be rude. But the moment our hands touched, something changed in his face. His smile faltered. His eyes went wide, scanning my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he pulled out his phone, fingers moving frantically across the screen. He stared at whatever he'd pulled up, then back at me, then at the phone again. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the suddenly silent room. "You're Dr. Noah?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I watched as confusion rippled through the crowd, saw my cousin's smirk dissolve into something uncertain. Her fiancé was still staring at me, his phone screen glowing between us like a tiny spotlight. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, then at her, then at all the faces turned toward me with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt something close to satisfaction. "Yeah," I said quietly. "That's me." Let me back up. 5 years ago, I was the family disappointment in a different way. I dropped out of medical school halfway through my residency, walked away from a prestigious program at a top hospital, and effectively flushed a decade of work and 6 figures of debt down the drain. The family had been furious. My parents couldn't look at me without disappointment clouding their eyes. My cousins, especially her, had made sure everyone knew what a failure I was. She'd been particularly vicious about it. At every family gathering I'd attended after that, she'd found ways to bring it up. "Remember when you were going to be a surgeon? Whatever happened to that?" "Oh, that's right. You quit." She'd said it with such sweetness, like she was genuinely curious and not twisting the knife. The truth was more complicated than anyone knew, but I'd stopped trying to explain. My mentor at the hospital had been running a clinical trial that turned out to be fraudulent. He'd been falsifying data, endangering patients, and when I'd discovered it and reported him, he'd made sure to destroy my reputation on his way down. Suddenly, I was the troublemaker, the guy who couldn't handle the pressure, the quitter. Fighting it would have meant years of legal battles I couldn't afford, so I'd walked away. But I hadn't given up on medicine. I'd just gone a different route. I'd started working as a janitor at a research hospital across the country. Night shifts, cleaning floors and bathrooms, emptying trash. It was humbling, exhausting work, but it gave me something I needed: access. I could observe, learn, and most importantly, I could continue my own research on my own time. The hospital had a policy that employees could use the facilities after hours for approved educational purposes, and I'd taken full advantage of it. For 5 years, I'd worked 40 hours a week cleaning, then spent another 40 in the hospital's research library and labs, developing a new approach to treating antibiotic-resistant infections. I'd published papers under a pseudonym, Dr. Noah, collaborating with researchers online who had no idea I spent my days mopping floors. I'd been careful, methodical, and obsessively private about my dual life. And 3 months ago, everything had changed. My research had led to a breakthrough, a new compound that showed remarkable promise in treating MRSA, and other resistant bacteria. I'd published the findings in a major medical journal, and the response had been explosive. Suddenly, Dr. Noah was being invited to conferences, interviewed by medical publications, and courted by pharmaceutical companies. 2 weeks ago, I'd accepted a position as the lead researcher at a biotech startup with a salary that made my family's old money look quaint. But I hadn't told anyone in my family. How could I? They'd made it clear years ago that they'd written me off, that I was the cautionary tale they'd tell their children about wasted potential. So I'd let them think what they wanted to think. I'd let my cousin spread her vicious little rumors about the toilet cleaner who'd given up on his dreams. And now her fiancé, who apparently worked in medical technology, had just connected the dots. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My cousin's fiancé was still holding my hand, his grip suddenly firmer, more respectful. He looked like he'd just met a celebrity, which I suppose, in his world, he had. He turned to my cousin, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you know who this is? This is Dr. Noah. The Dr. Noah. The researcher who just revolutionized antibiotic treatment. His work is going to save thousands of lives. Millions, probably." My cousin's face went through several rapid transformations. Confusion, disbelief, then something that looked like she'd just swallowed glass. She tried to laugh it off, looking around at the other relatives who were now murmuring and pulling out their own phones. "That can't be right," she said, her voice higher than usual. "He's a janitor. He cleans toilets." Her fiancé finally released my hand, but he was shaking his head, still staring at his phone screen. "I've been following Dr. Noah's research for months. My company was trying to recruit him. We offered him $3 million a year, and he turned us down." He looked at me with something close to awe. "You turned us down." I shrugged, feeling the eyes of 40 relatives boring into me. "The other offer was better," I said simply. What followed was predictable chaos. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Distant uncles who'd barely acknowledged my existence were clapping me on the back. Aunts who'd whispered about my poor choices were asking about my research. Even my parents pushed through the crowd, my mother's eyes bright with tears she didn't have the right to shed. But I wasn't interested in their sudden acceptance. I was watching my cousin, who'd gone pale and quiet, standing slightly behind her fiancé like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. She met my eyes once, and I saw it there. The realization of what she'd done, what she'd said, and who'd been standing in the room to hear it. Her fiancé was still gushing about my research, explaining to anyone who'd listen about the significance of the breakthrough, the potential applications, the lives that would be saved. He kept trying to pull my cousin into the conversation, asking if she'd known about this, clearly proud to have this connection through his future wife's family. She couldn't even look at him. She mumbled something about needing air and slipped out of the room. I let her go. This wasn't about her, not really. This was about every person in this room who'd decided my worth based on my worst moment, who'd chosen to believe the easy narrative instead of asking questions, who'd found it more satisfying to mock me than to wonder if there might be more to the story. My father approached me, his hand extended in that formal way he had. "Son," he said, and I could hear the weight of 5 years of silence in that single word. "We had no idea. If we'd known what you were working on, we would have." "Would have what?" I cut him off, keeping my voice level. "Supported me, believed in me, because I could have used that 5 years ago when everyone decided I was a failure." He had the decency to look ashamed. "Your mother and I, we thought you'd given up. We thought you were wasting your life." "I was working 2 full-time jobs," I said quietly. "One that paid the bills and one that mattered. You just couldn't see past the first one." My mother was crying openly now, reaching for me like I was still a child she could comfort. But I stepped back. I wasn't ready for this, for their sudden pride and belated support. I'd learned to live without it, and I wasn't sure I wanted it back now that it came with conditions and qualifications. The party continued around us, but the atmosphere had shifted. People were looking at me differently now, with respect and curiosity instead of pity and judgment. It should have felt good, this vindication I'd unknowingly orchestrated. But mostly I just felt tired. I found my cousin outside on the terrace, leaning against the railing and staring out at the manicured gardens. She didn't turn when I approached, but I could see her shoulders tense. We stood there in silence for a minute before she spoke. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "I'm not," I said honestly. "I didn't plan any of this. I didn't even know you were engaged, much less that your fiancé would recognize me." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Of course you didn't. You never cared what we thought, did you? You just disappeared and let us all think whatever we wanted. I cared, I corrected her. For a long time, I cared too much. But you made it clear that nothing I said would change your mind about who you thought I was. So I stopped trying. She turned to look at me then, and I was surprised to see anger in her eyes instead of shame. You could have told us what you were doing. You could have explained about the scandal at your old hospital, about your research. Instead, you let us think the worst. Would you have believed me? I asked. If I'd told you 5 years ago that I was working on something important, that I hadn't given up, would any of you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was making excuses? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. You want to know the truth? I said, feeling 5 years of hurt and anger rising up. The truth is that I needed you all to think I'd failed. I needed the pressure off, the expectations gone. Every time I came home before and you asked about medical school, about my career, about living up to the family name, it was like drowning. I couldn't breathe under the weight of who you all needed me to be. So you became a janitor, she said, and I couldn't tell if it was a question or an accusation. So I became free, I corrected. Free to work on what mattered without anyone watching over my shoulder, judging every choice. Free to fail and try again without disappointing anyone but myself. You all wrote me off, and that was the best thing that could have happened to me. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. Then she said something I didn't expect. I'm sorry. I looked at her, trying to gauge if she meant it. She was staring down at her hands, twisting the enormous engagement ring on her finger. I was cruel, she continued. I made fun of you, spread gossip about you, treated you like you were beneath me. I told myself it was because I was disappointed, because I cared about you and wanted better for you. But that wasn't really it. Then what was it? I asked. She took a shaky breath. It was because watching you give up made me feel better about not trying. I went into finance because it's what was expected, what was safe. I'm marrying him because he's successful and stable and my parents approve. I've never taken a risk in my life, never pursued anything just because it mattered to me. And seeing you walk away from everything, even if I thought you were failing, it scared me. Because it meant that there were other options, other ways to live, and I wasn't brave enough to choose them. I didn't know what to say to that. In all the scenarios I'd imagined for this reunion, my cousin having a moment of genuine self-reflection hadn't been one of them. Your fiancé seems nice, I offered finally. She laughed softly. He is. He's perfect on paper. But when he looked at you tonight, when he realized who you were, I saw something in his eyes that he's never had for me. Respect. Admiration. Real excitement about something that matters. And I realized that I've spent my whole life trying to impress people like him, but I've never done anything worth respecting. It's not too late, I said. You're still young. You could still. No, she interrupted. I've made my choices. I'm not saying they're wrong, just that they're safe. And I need to stop punishing people who choose differently. She looked at me directly then. I'm sorry for how I treated you. You deserved better from me, from all of us. I nodded, accepting the apology for what it was. It didn't erase 5 years of small cruelties, but it was something. Thank you, I said simply. We stood there together on the terrace, two cousins who'd grown up together and grown apart, finding an unexpected moment of understanding in the rubble of old assumptions. Inside, I could hear the party continuing, my name being passed around like a trophy everyone wanted to claim. Are you going to come back in? She asked. They all want to celebrate you now. I shook my head. I think I've had enough family reunion for one lifetime. Besides, I have work tomorrow. Real work, not just cleaning toilets. She smiled at that, a real smile this time. Will you at least stay in touch? I'd like to know how the research goes, how your life goes, if you're willing to let me back in. I considered it. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep the distance I'd carefully built between myself and the family that had hurt me. But another part, the part that remembered being kids together before everything got complicated, wanted to try. Maybe, I said. We'll see. She nodded, accepting this small olive branch. Then she straightened her shoulders and headed back inside, back to her perfect fiancé and her safe life and the family that had never questioned her choices. I stayed on the terrace a while longer, looking out at the gardens and thinking about the strange path that had led me here. In the end, it wasn't the revenge I'd fantasized about. I hadn't planned this dramatic revelation, hadn't orchestrated my cousin's humiliation. Life had just happened to unfold in a way that proved what I'd known all along. That worth isn't measured in job titles or family approval. and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose your own path, even when everyone thinks you're lost. Update 1. 3 months after the reunion, my life had become unrecognizable in the best possible way. The biotech startup had moved into a new facility, and my team had expanded to 15 researchers. We were in phase 2 trials for the antibiotic treatment, and the early results were even better than we'd hoped. But the real change wasn't professional. It was personal. My cousin had reached out a week after the reunion, sending a long email that was equal parts apology and explanation. She'd broken off her engagement. Not because of what happened at the party, she was careful to explain, but because the party had made her realize she was marrying for all the wrong reasons. She'd enrolled in a graduate program for environmental science, something she'd apparently dreamed about since college, but never pursued because it wasn't practical enough for the family. We'd started having coffee once a month, awkward at first, but gradually more comfortable. She was different away from the family spotlight, more honest, more vulnerable. She told me about the pressure she'd felt her whole life to be perfect, to make all the right choices, to never disappoint anyone. I told her about the loneliness of those 5 years, working 2 jobs, and having no one to share my small victories with. My parents had tried to reconcile too, but that was harder. They wanted to be proud of me now, wanted to brag about their son, the famous researcher, but they couldn't quite acknowledge how much their judgment had hurt. My mother kept saying things like, "We always knew you'd do something special," rewriting history to make themselves the supportive parents they'd never actually been. I'd set boundaries. I saw them for dinner once every few months, kept the conversations surface level, didn't let them back into the private parts of my life they'd forfeited the right to know about. It wasn't cruel, just self-protective. I'd learned to live without their approval, and I wasn't going to become dependent on it again just because they'd decided I was worth supporting after all. The biggest surprise came from my cousin's ex-fiancé. He'd reached out professionally, apologizing for any awkwardness he'd caused at the reunion and asking if I'd be interested in consulting for his company. The money was absurd, but I'd accepted because the work was interesting and because, despite everything, he seemed like a genuinely good guy who'd gotten caught in the crossfire of family drama that had nothing to do with him. During one of our meetings, he'd asked me about that night, what it felt like to walk into that room knowing everyone thought so little of me, how I'd managed to keep my composure when my cousin said what she said. I'd thought about it before answering. Honestly, I told him. It felt like proof. Proof that their opinion of me had never been about who I actually was, only about what they could see from their limited perspective. And once I understood that, once I really believed it, their judgment couldn't touch me anymore. He nodded thoughtfully. "She talked about you sometimes," he said. "Your cousin. Before the reunion, I mean. She'd mention you in this dismissive way, like you were a cautionary tale. But there was always something else underneath it, something that seemed like maybe she was trying to convince herself more than me." "What happened between you two?" I'd asked. "After the reunion." He'd shrugged. I realized I didn't actually know her. We'd been together for 2 years, engaged for 6 months, and I didn't know what she was afraid of or what she wanted beyond the next right step. When she broke it off, I was relieved. That probably says everything. The research continued to evolve. We'd attracted attention from major hospitals and health organizations around the world. I'd given talks at conferences, been interviewed for medical journals, even appeared on a few podcasts aimed at healthcare professionals. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most was the work itself, knowing that we were close to something that would genuinely help people. I'd kept the apartment near the hospital, the small 1-bedroom I'd rented when I first took the janitor job. My colleagues thought it was weird that I hadn't upgraded despite the salary increase, but I liked it. It reminded me of who I'd been, what I'd survived, the version of myself I never wanted to forget. Some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I'd walk through the hospital halls where I used to clean. The night janitor now knew me as Dr. Noah, but he also knew my story, knew that I'd worked his job before everything changed. We'd talk sometimes during his breaks, and I'd tell him about the research or listen to him talk about his own dreams of going back to school. I'd started a small scholarship fund for hospital staff who wanted to pursue education. It wasn't public, wasn't attached to my name, just a quiet way of paying forward the opportunity I'd been given. Because the truth was, that job had saved me. It had given me the space to rebuild myself away from expectations and judgment, and I wanted others to have that same chance. My cousin told me once that she thought I'd gotten my revenge at the reunion, that I must have felt vindicated when everyone realized who I was. But she was wrong. The revenge wasn't in their recognition or her humiliation. The revenge was simpler and more profound than that. The revenge was that I'd built a life I was proud of without needing any of them to believe in it. The revenge was that their opinion had stopped mattering years ago, and I'd kept going anyway. The revenge was that I was happy, genuinely happy, and their approval or disapproval had nothing to do with it. That night at the reunion hadn't been about proving them wrong. It had just been a moment when two separate parts of my life unexpectedly collided, when the person they'd dismissed and the person I'd become suddenly occupied the same space. The real story wasn't about a dramatic reveal or a cousin getting her comeuppance. It was about the quiet victory of choosing yourself when everyone else has written you off, of trusting your own path even when it looks like failure to everyone watching, of understanding that sometimes the people who love you least see you most clearly, and that's why you have to stop letting them define your worth. I was Dr. Noah now, respected researcher, leader of a promising team, contributor to science that would outlive me. But I was also still the guy who'd cleaned toilets for 5 years, who'd worked 80-hour weeks because he believed in something no one else could see, who'd walked away from everything safe and certain because staying would have killed something essential inside him. Both of those people were me. Both of those stories were true, and I'd finally learned that I didn't need anyone's permission to own them both. My cousin texted me last week asking if I'd come to her graduate school orientation, said she wanted someone there who understood why it mattered. I'd said yes, not because we were back to how things were before, but because we were building something different, something more honest than what we'd had as kids. Forgiveness is complicated. Family is complicated. But sometimes, if you're lucky, people grow up enough to see each other clearly, to apologize for real, to start over with fewer illusions and more grace. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just living well, working hard, and refusing to let anyone else's limitations become your own. I'm Dr. Noah. I used to clean toilets. Both of those things are true, and I'm proud of both. That's all the revenge I ever needed.